Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and today I'm going to be talking about Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte and Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I read Rebecca earlier on this month and really enjoyed it. I really loved it, and one of the things I loved so much about it was that I think there are a lot of really interesting ways in which it compares to Jane Eyre, so I thought I would like to make a video comparing the two and talking about how reading Rebecca as a kind of retelling of Jane Eyre can make it even more interesting. But this video is going to involve a lot of spoilers, so unless you have read both of these books, I advise that you leave this video now and go away and read both of these books because they are both excellent. A while back I made a video called The Drunk Man in the Metaphorical Attic, which was a comparison between Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and Anne Bronte's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, where I talked about how if you look at those two books and how similar in some ways their plots are, it can kind of enrich the way that you read both of them, and looking at the ways in which the differences in the plot make a difference to the overall impression of the book can tell us quite a lot about each of the individual books. I'll link that video down below if you have read both of these books, but I wanted to do a similar thing today with Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, because one thing I found reading Rebecca incredibly striking is how similar it is in many ways to Jane Eyre, and how the differences it has to Jane Eyre are very telling and in some ways slightly critical to Jane Eyre, because there are some aspects of it that it pushes to a greater extent than Jane Eyre does, and therefore in a way is a kind of commentary on Jane Eyre. And I think it's quite interesting to look at Rebecca as a kind of subversive retelling of Jane Eyre in a way. So I thought I would talk about these two today. So I'm going to start off by talking about the similarities between them, first in sort of plot and plot structure, and then in characterization, and then I will go on to talk about the differences between them and what that symbolises. And obviously these books are pretty different in their setting and their plot and their characters, but I do think there are a lot of similarities in the kind of central premise or plot. In both of them, we have a young, self-conscious, lower middle class woman just out of school, between the age of 18 to 21, who meets and falls in love with an upper class man, some 20 years or more her senior, who is kind of brooding, in his 40s, with a somewhat shady past, including a first marriage to a wife he hated. The couple fall in love, he proposes marriage, and at some point in the book, roughly at the middle point of both of these, she finds out that he has a dark secret he's been keeping from her. In Jane Eyre, it is that his first wife is still alive, and in Rebecca, it is that he murdered his first wife. And this revelation prompts the plot of the second half of the book, and we end with a kind of sort of happy but slightly not happy ending in which the couple end up together and the great house, Thornfield Hall in Jane Eyre and Manderley in Rebecca, burns down. When you break it down in that way, these books have quite similar plots, and obviously there are a lot of differences between them, but I do think there are similar aspects to them. I just talked about the general plot, but I think you can also see a lot of similarities in the relationship between Jane and Rochester, and the relationship between Maxim and our unnamed heroine in Rebecca. I'll talk a little bit later on in the video about the differences in these two relationships, because I do think the differences are quite important and telling too. But in both of these relationships we have an age difference, we have a class difference, and we have a power difference. And I think there are certain aspects of Jane's relationship with Rochester and the unnamed heroine, and this with Maxim, that are quite similar in the ways that we see the sort of self-consciousness and the youngness in many ways of Jane and unnamed heroine, and we also see how they come to rely in some ways on a man who has more power than them and who has a complicated past, and we see a lot of uncertainty on the part of Jane and on the part of our unnamed narrator. I do think that Jane in general is a more sort of confident character, as I'll talk about in a bit, but both Jane and our unnamed narrator in Rebecca are very self-conscious, very self-doubting, and can't really understand why this man, who to them is so interesting and fascinating, could possibly like them. They don't understand why this man would love them, and that in a way gives the man even more power. Another thing I think it's interesting to compare is the roles that Manderley plays in Rebecca and Thornfield Hall in Jane Eyre. Both of these are big, grand English country houses with long family history, an influence of the Gothic. They have this big status symbol in that they are such big and important houses, and they also have forbidden spaces in both of them. In Manderley, it is the wing that Mrs. De Winter used to occupy, which is all now shut up, and our unnamed narrator doesn't feel able to go in, and when she does go in, she gets accosted by Mrs. Danvers, who was devoted to Rebecca. And similarly in Jane Eyre, there are spaces which are forbidden, the places in which Mr. Rochester's wife Bertha lives, which are guarded by Grace Poole, who, although I don't think is nearly as important or as developed in Jane Eyre as Mrs. Danvers is, I do think you can see as kind of playing a similar sinister role, and Jane Eyre certainly feels unnerved of and scared by Grace Poole in Jane Eyre in a kind of sort of similar way to the unnamed heroine does towards Mrs. Danvers, although I think it's certainly much more extreme and a bigger part of the book in Rebecca. Although interesting, of course, to note that Grace Poole is kind of shown to be a sort of good woman in this, whereas Mrs. Danvers is obviously not. And then another thing I think is quite interesting to compare in these two books is Bertha and Rebecca. Let me read you what Mr. Rochester says about Bertha Mason in Jane Eyre. I lived with that woman upstairs 4 years, and before that time she had tried me indeed. Her character ripened and developed with frightful rapidity. Her voices sprang up fast and rank. They were so strong only cruelty could check them, and I would not use cruelty. Bertha Mason, the true daughter of an infamous mother, dragged me through all the hideous and degrading agonies which must attend a man bound to a wife, at once intemperate and unchaste. Intemperate and unchaste. I could not rid myself of it by any legal proceedings, for the doctors now discovered that my wife was mad. Her excesses had prematurely developed the germs of insanity. That's what Mr. Rochester says about Bertha. Now let me read what Maxim says about Rebecca. You thought I loved Rebecca. You thought I killed her, loving her. I hated her, I tell you. Our marriage was a farce from the very first. She was vicious, damnable, rotten through and through. We never loved each other, never had one moment of happiness together. Rebecca was incapable of love, of tenderness, of decency. She was not even normal. And what he uses effectively as the justification for having killed her is the fact that she had so many affairs, that she told him she was pregnant with another man's child, and that throughout their marriage she left him incredibly unhappy and incredibly worried for the status and reputation of himself and his family. And I think you can see very, very similar attitudes in both of these. When Maxim says Rebecca was not even normal, there is an echo of Mr. Rochester saying that his wife is mad, and obviously in Jane Eyre, Bertha is presented as having very serious mental health problems, whereas Rebecca is not, although she is presented as being that ambiguous not normal. But both of them are presented as bad wives, who are described first as being flirtatious, unchaste, and sort of violent or aggressive, and then described as being in some way mentally abnormal, which I think is quite interesting. And obviously the fates they have are very, very different, and the ways that Rochester and Maxim react are very, very different. But I do think it's quite interesting to compare Bertha and Rebecca, and this idea that comes up in a lot of Victorian literature and also some later literature like Rebecca, that women who are deemed unusual or bad within society are labelled insane. There's quite a few Victorian novels where such things occur, the idea that immoral behaviour in a woman must be caused by insanity, which I think you can see echoes of in Rebecca and Jane Eyre. Although I also think it's interesting to note that while Maxim describes Rebecca as not normal, the only character in Rebecca who is presented as having a mental disability or proper mental health issues like Bertha Mason does is Ben, who is not presented as being a sinister figure in any way, and in fact the first time we get an inkling that Rebecca might not have been such a lovely person. And for me, the thing that is most chilling about Rebecca is when Ben says in really intense fear to our narrator something like, "You're not going to send me to an asylum, are you?" Because Rebecca threatened to send him to an asylum. So I think that's all I wanted to say on sort of the broad similarities, and now I want to talk about the differences within these similarities and what they might signify. First, I want to talk a little bit about Rochester and Maxim, because I do think they are very different characters, and I definitely think Rochester is presented as being a much more sympathetic character than Maxim is. Certainly I did not like Maxim, although I know that a lot of people read Jane Eyre and don't like Mr. Rochester, and I sometimes wonder if I had read this at the same age as I'm reading Rebecca, whether I would have liked him less, I don't know. But I do think Rochester is in general a much more sympathetic character than Maxim, and the similarities between Maxim and Rochester almost for me make Maxim feel like a critique of Rochester, saying, okay, so this is what Mr. Rochester does, but actually is kind of really, really similar to the way that Maxim behaves. But I do want to address the way that both of these men deal with being trapped in a marriage with someone they despise and who they feel ashamed of. Rochester confines his wife within the house and hides her existence from the knowledge of the world, but he does also in some way try to do his duty by her. He doesn't want to send her to an asylum because he thinks that he could take better care of her in the house. He employs someone to take care of her and he tries to give her some kind of life. Obviously very, very problematic and so on, but you know, probably better than Maxim, who kills his wife. And what I find very interesting in both of these books is the reactions of the women. Jane's reaction in this is to run. Though she loves him, though she knows that they could go abroad and live together and be away from all of this, her reaction on finding out that he already has a wife and on finding out their whole history is to leave, which she does. And she does return to him later on in the book, of course, but only after his wife is dead. And I think it's important that Jane's reaction to this is to leave him. And this is partly, I think, to do with her morality and her religion and her force of character, but I also think it's partly to do with the fact that Rochester's crime is a crime against her, that he has lied to her and that he has tried to trick her into bigamy, which is illegal, and, you know, that's quite bad. So I think that's quite interesting to see. Whereas in Rebecca, for the unnamed heroine, Maxim's crime was to Rebecca and not to her, and knowing that he killed Rebecca and that he never loved her means for her that she knows he loves her truly, and therefore not only does she stay, but she seems to fall more in love with him. She seems to develop more personality. She feels she has more power over him, over the servants, over everyone around them, and she clings to Maxim. Her reaction is not to fly and to leave as Jane's does, but to cling to him, despite the fact that what Maxim does is much more heinous and much more terrifying, especially because at the time when our heroine forgives Maxim, she not only thinks that Maxim killed Rebecca, but that he killed her unborn child as well. And I think it's partly, as I said, because for the unnamed heroine of Rebecca, the crime is to Rebecca and not to herself, whereas in Jane Eyre there has been a wrong done to Jane Eyre by Rochester too. And I think it's partly as well to do with the slightly different power dynamics and the differences in character between our unnamed heroine and Jane Eyre. So I quickly want to talk about the two different relationships and their differences, because I do think that Jane Eyre and Rochester stand on much more equal terms than they do in Rebecca. There are a couple of things I think it's worth talking about here. Firstly, the dialogue between Jane and Rochester feels much more like they are on equal terms. They have conversations as intellectual equals, whatever their social status may be. And also in Jane Eyre, by the end of the book, by the time that Jane and Rochester are finally allowed to be together, Charlotte Bronte has engineered to put them on more equal footing. Jane has inherited quite a lot of money, Rochester's house has burned down, and in the fire he has physically injured himself and become blind, meaning he is now much more reliant on Jane, whereas in the past she was more reliant on him, which puts them sort of on a more equal footing. Whereas in Rebecca, the relationship between Maxim and the narrator is always very unequal. They never seem to talk on equal terms, and she says repeatedly throughout the book that he treats her just as he treats his dog Jasper, that he treats her like a pet, and I don't think that changes. He treats her with fondness, but not always, I think, with respect. They do not stand on equal terms. And I almost wonder if the relationship between Maxim and the unnamed heroine here is a kind of commentary on Jane and Rochester, because the power dynamics to begin with in terms of class and age and experience is quite similar. And by making Maxim a sort of more extreme version of Rochester with more of the darkness within him and more of the broodingness and more of the tendency to dominate, and by making the unnamed heroine have more of Jane's self-consciousness and self-deprecating nature, in a way Daphne du Maurier comments on the power imbalance and the possible dangers of the relationship between Jane and Rochester in Jane Eyre. Part of the reason I think why the power dynamic feels so different is because Maxim is a much sort of stronger character and a much more fully presented character than our unnamed heroine. We don't even know her name, we know nothing about her background really, apart from that her parents are dead. And we know very little of her character. She feels that she has very little identity, and she's always defining herself against Maxim or against Mrs. Danvers or against Rebecca for the most part, comparing herself to Rebecca in order to try and give herself an identity, because she doesn't really feel that she has one. In comparison to Jane Eyre, where I think Jane Eyre has a much greater sense of self. She may not always like herself, she may not always approve of herself, but she has a much stronger sense of self, and we get a much stronger sense of herself, if only because we follow her from her childhood as well, and we know so much more of her background and her internal thoughts. Her analysis, I suppose, whereas we rarely get analysis from the unnamed heroine in Rebecca, though we get a lot of imagination and a lot of possibilities of the future that she's thinking about and scenes of the past that she imagines in her head, but she's not quite as analytical as Jane is. Even if you look at the titles of these two books, Jane Eyre tells her own story and gives it her name. This is her book. Even in the title of Rebecca, Rebecca dominates and overshadows our heroine, our narrator, whose name we never know. I think it's also interesting to look at the endings of these two books. Jane Eyre, on its surface, has a very happy ending. Jane and Rochester are together, he begins to get his sight back, she has money, and they're going to live a happy, equal life. And of course, I think it can be more problematic than that. I really love Jane Eyre a lot, and I do enjoy the love story, but I think it's fair to say that the power imbalance between them and the fact that he lied to her for quite a long time might also make their marriage a little difficult at times. And it is, in some ways, a little problematic. I know a lot of people wish that Jane Eyre did not marry Rochester at the end, but went and did something else with her life instead. But I think Daphne du Maurier in this, by having Maxim and the narrator end sort of closer together, but in a very sinister way. Maxim has become a sinister character by now, and our narrator follows him blindly and still clings to him, and we end in the end of this book with them in the car, in the dark, watching Manderley burn down. It's an incredibly ominous ending, even if you believe that Maxim was driven to kill Rebecca or tricked to kill her, and that he is fundamentally a good person and loves our heroine, which I'm not sure I do. It's still an incredibly ominous ending. And for me, in a way, the ending of this and how ominous it is, and having that fire of that great house echo so strongly Jane Eyre, it also kind of problematizes the ending of Jane Eyre as well. So I think that is probably all I wanted to say about these two books. Both are brilliant and both are really interesting, and I think it's very interesting to look at Rebecca as a kind of retelling of Jane Eyre, or at least a book that is very inspired by Jane Eyre and takes a lot of similar themes, weaves them together to create a slightly different story, but one that has a lot of echoes and bits of reminiscence towards Jane Eyre, which made me very happy while reading it, because it's just so interesting. I really, really loved reading Rebecca, and I'm really, really excited to read more Daphne du Maurier in the future, and it was really interesting to compare it to Jane Eyre. Please let me know down in the comments what you think about the similarities and differences between Rebecca and Jane Eyre, if you noticed any when you read Rebecca or Jane Eyre, depending on which I suppose you read first. And yeah, I would love to continue this discussion down in the comments because I found it really, really interesting. And also people who have read more Daphne du Maurier than me, do recommend me where to go next, considering how much I loved Rebecca, and let me know if any of the rest of Daphne du Maurier's books are somewhat Bronte-esque as well. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.